Bryce David Laspisa was born on April 30th of 1994, the only child of parents Karen and Michael. Bryce spent his childhood in the small city of Springfield, Illinois, and demonstrated considerable creative talents from an early age. He grew to be an easygoing, amicable young man, traits which won him many friends throughout the years at Naperville Central High School. Following his graduation in 2012, Bryce and his parents relocated to Southern California, allowing him to pursue a graphic and industrial design major at Sacramento's Sierra College. During his freshman year, Bryce maintained a great GPA, made fast friends with his roommate, Sean Dixon, and even found himself a girlfriend in the form of a fellow student, Kim Sly. His future seemed bright, but heartbreak, tragedy, and mystery were right around the corner. A few months into Bryce's sophomore year, Sean and Kim began to notice some rather alarming behavioral changes. The usually outgoing and affable young man they'd known during their freshman year was gone, and was instead replaced by someone who seemed erratic, withdrawn, and increasingly depressed. The pair gave Bryce some space at first, assuming that he was simply going through a rough patch. But it wasn't long before Kim found something in her boyfriend's possession, something she found deeply concerning. Hidden away in a drawer of Bryce's desk was a small bottle of pills labeled Vyvanse. Vyvanse is used to treat attention deficit hyperactivity disorder in people over the age of 5, as well as moderate to severe binge eating disorders in adults. To Kim's knowledge, Bryce wasn't suffering from either condition, so she confronted him on the usage of the medication. He told Kim that he used Vyvanse to stay alert during late-night video game sessions, and dismissed accusations that he was abusing it. Bryce claimed that he was microdosing and would thus avoid any ill effects. However, his newfound anxiety and irritability showed that he was already suffering from the medication's side effects. If you do a quick visit to Vyvanse's website, it will reveal several worrying side effects about their medication. These include new behavioral problems, new bipolar illness, and new forms of psychosis, such as believing things that aren't true, seeing or hearing voices that aren't real, and paranoia. It's not clear how Bryce came to be in possession of the pills, but many have alleged that an underground pharmaceutical trade is rife on the US college campuses. It seems almost every student in America is aware of someone who popped a few Adderall to plow through a late-night study session. And these days, the use of performance-enhancing drugs is becoming increasingly common with the lucrative but cutthroat world of monetized gaming. Yet back then, Bryce didn't appear to be taking in any such competition, and he told Kim he was only taking Vyvanse to increase his chances of gaming glory. However, this seemed so out of character for Bryce that Kim began to suspect that there were other reasons behind his drug use, and this was corroborated by his roommate Sean. Sean told Kim that he too was becoming more and more concerned with Bryce's behavior, and reported that not only was he taking a worrying amount of Vyvanse, but that he'd begun drinking hard liquor on a near daily basis. There was clearly something else going on in Bryce's life, something which caused him to heavily self-medicate. But when Kim and Sean tried to get to the bottom of it, Bryce pushed them away. Bryce went on to more or less accuse Kim and Sean of conspiring against him. And without their pleas for temperance, his abuse of drugs and alcohol mounted. At first, he seemed hideously angry at his two closest friends, but by the end of August, his demeanor appeared to have shifted drastically. He sent Kim a breakup text on August 27th of 2013. One included the line, "You'll be better off without me." Bryce also sent Sean an unusually heartfelt text message, one which read, "I love you, bro. Seriously. You're the best person I've ever met. You saved my soul." That very same day, Bryce gave Sean his Xbox as well as a very expensive pair of diamond earrings. Since it's common for those considering suicide to give away some of their most prized possessions, Kim and Sean's concern for Bryce reached fever pitch. On August 28th, they contacted Bryce's mother, Karen, to confide their fears to her. Later that evening, Bryce called his mother to inform her that he was with Kim. and that she'd confiscated his car keys on suspicion that he was unfit to drive. Bryce apparently swore to his mother that he was sober, leading Karen to convince Kim to hand over her son's keys. Karen essentially told her, "I'll handle this," and promised Kim that she'd fly up to Sacramento in the morning so she could deal with the situation herself. Before leaving Kim's apartment at around 11:30 p.m., Bryce agreed to meet with his mother in person, but only on the condition that they talk on the phone prior to her flight. "I have a lot to talk to you about," he reportedly said. Around 90 minutes later, in the early hours of August 29th, Bryce once again called his mother. She later said she assumed he was calling from his apartment, yet phone records would show the call from around 50 miles south of Sierra College. Although he didn't inform either his mother or his friends, Bryce was on the road, and he was driving in the direction of Orange County and his parents' house. Karen Laspisa only discovered her son had been driving at around 11 a.m. when she and her husband were notified that Bryce had utilized their insurance roadside assistance service. After requesting more details from their insurance company, Karen was informed that a man named Christian, owner of Castro Tire and Gas in the town of Buttonwillow, had delivered 3 gallons of gasoline to Bryce at around 9 a.m. after he reported that he'd run out of fuel. Karen managed to get in touch with Castro Tire and Gas and convinced Christian to drive back to Bryce's last known location. Her son hadn't been answering his phone, and she was terrified that something had happened to him. Christian sympathized with the frantic mother and did as she requested. But when he arrived at Bryce's last known location, he discovered that the young man's car was still there. Bryce appeared to have been seen sleeping when Christian approached, no doubt exhausted from driving all night. He seemed disoriented, but was receptive when Christian informed him of his mother's concerns. We can safely assume that Bryce claimed his phone was out of battery, since Christian then took upon himself to inform Karen of her son's whereabouts. It was around 3 p.m. when Christian contacted Karen. During that phone call, he mentioned that Bryce had gotten back on the road. It was roughly 3 hours' drive from his parents' house in Orange County, yet 3 hours came and went, and Bryce was still nowhere to be seen. Finally, on the evening of August 29th, Karen and Michael Laspisa filed a missing persons report detailing the abnormal behavior with the preceded Bryce's disappearance. The Orange County Sheriff's Department then tracked Bryce's cell phone data, and they were able to track down his last known movements to just a few miles from the spot that Christian the mechanic had paid him a visit. 2 uniformed officers then drove out to Bryce's location, where they found his demeanor to be rather disarming. Bryce seemed lucid and friendly, and was at worst just a little tired. He showed no signs of intoxication, and after a brief search, the officers found no drugs or alcohol in his possession. For the second time that day, Bryce was informed that his parents were deeply concerned for him, and he was advised to drive to their home immediately so that they could resolve whatever issues were worrying them. The uniformed officers then contacted Bryce's parents to tell them that he was back on the I-5, headed south, and would be in their company within the hour or two. This was a huge relief to the couple, who seemed quite certain that the ordeal was finally about to be over. But in reality, Bryce would never make it home, and the events of that night were the beginning of an enduring, perplexing, and deeply disturbing mystery. At around 2 a.m., in the wee small hours of August 30th, Bryce called his parents to tell them that he was too tired to drive and was pulling into a motel to sleep. Karen agreed with her son's judgment, and they agreed to just see each other in the morning. Then, just after 8 a.m., the Laspisas heard the doorbell ring. When they opened the door, they expected to see their son. Instead, only a long highway patrol officer was there to greet them. Bryce's car had been discovered abandoned near a place known as the Castaic Lake. The car's rear window had been shattered, and although his phone, laptop, and wallet remained inside, there was no trace of Bryce himself. The officer informed Bryce's parents that a preliminary investigation had been completed, and that surveillance footage showed him turning onto an access road at about 2:15 a.m. This didn't quite contradict Bryce's assertion that he was going to get some sleep, as he'd already caught some shut-eye at the roadside just a few hours before. But the town of Castaic has 3 motels available, all of them for under $100 a night. Bryce certainly wasn't broke, and the chances of all 3 motels being booked are very slim. So why did he choose to drive toward Castaic Lake? And why was his back window broken when all his valuables remained inside? Sadly enough, suicide swiftly became the prevailing theory, and Los Angeles County sent a team of specialist drivers to dredge Castaic Lake for any sign of Bryce's body. The lake is just shy of 9 miles long and is complete with a multitude of covers and inlets. Searching it represented a mammoth task for that diving team. But they were more than up to the job. For almost 2 weeks straight, the divers spent around 12 hours a day swimming through Castaic's murky waters. And by the end of it, not a single trace of human remains were uncovered. With the lake now firmly ruled out, law enforcement began scouring the surrounding hillsides for any trace of Bryce's body. They found traces of human remains, but neither belonged to Bryce. Law enforcement also deployed a police K9 unit, one equipped with a highly trained sniffer dog, capable of tracking Bryce's movements. The team uncovered evidence that Bryce had not perished at the lake, as his scent led them to a nearby truck stop, where it suddenly went cold. Some have argued that this is the most compelling evidence of Bryce's continued survival, while others say there are much more sinister implications. Just because Bryce's scent led to that truck stop didn't mean he made it there in one piece. There's a possibility it wasn't Bryce that disappeared after reaching that truck stop, but rather his killer. Without a body on which to base a final conclusion, the LA County Sheriff Department was unable to close this case, and Bryce Laspisa remains listed as a missing person still today. The prevailing theory is that Bryce suffered some kind of psychotic break, induced by either his drug or alcohol abuse, or by the sudden and crushing depression that Vyvanse withdrawal is known to cause. Perhaps the best clue to his mindset at the time was that text to Kim, the one which stated, "You're better off without me." There's also a chance that Bryce abandoned his car and possession at Castaic Lake because he wished to start an entirely new life, someplace else. He could have smashed his own rear window as a final violent farewell. After all, there's a chance he believed that his parents, as well as the wider authorities, were using the vehicle to track his movements. If he was still abusing Vyvanse, being repeatedly tracked down by an auto repairman, and police officers might have fed into his paranoid delusions. But perhaps Bryce wasn't being paranoid. Perhaps he was really only microdosing the drug. Vyvanse's side effects became a convenient way to explain something of a far more sinister nature. What if Bryce had really gotten himself into some kind of trouble, and that his alcoholism was intended to relieve stress? Perhaps his frequent stops were supposed to serve as meeting places, and that he intended to purchase more pharmaceuticals from a new contact. Then, maybe like drug deals are prone to do, it went wrong, violently wrong. And instead of walking away with Bryce's cash, his dealers were forced to dispose of his body. However, if this were the case, there would have been ample evidence on his phone to implicate the guilty party, and to date, there have been no such arrest. As we approach the 10th anniversary of Bryce Laspisa's disappearance, dozens of questions remain firmly unanswered. Yet for some, hope hasn't dwindled. "I'll never give up hope," his mother later told journalists. "But every day of not knowing is gut-wrenching, a living nightmare." Despite there being no developments in the case for almost a decade, Bryce's parents refuse to accept that their son is dead and gone. They still post missing flyers while raising awareness through different forms of social media. And in 2016, they gave permission for Bryce's story to be featured on Season 7 of the ID channel's Disappeared. As a result of the continued interest in this case, as well as the vast amount of information available online, many have argued that the key to solving the mystery of Bryce's disappearance is to find whoever gave him a ride at that truck stop. People don't just disappear into thin air. There is always trails, be they physical, digital, or anecdotal. Perhaps the person who gave Bryce a ride in the early hours of August 30th is simply unaware that they are a key witness in a decade-long mystery. A mystery that's left two loving parents bereft and heartbroken. But then again, Maybe the reason they haven't come forward is because they were the ones to take Bryce's life. And it wouldn't be the first time a lone trucker preyed on someone who was already slipping off the grid. And if Bryce maintained the same aggressive mood that caused him to smash his own rear window, there's no telling what might have happened if he climbed into the cab of an unsuspecting trucker. Bryce was 5'11" and 170 pounds when he went missing. He has fiery red hair, pale blue eyes, and a large tribal Taurus tattoo on his upper left arm. If you know of or have spotted someone who matches that description, contact the Laspisa family on 949-292-4400. It might well be too late at this point, but there's always a chance that we can help bring Bryce finally home. On January 1st of 2008, 15-year-old Amy Fitzpatrick spent the evening babysitting with one of her friends, Ashley Rose. The two girls lived in a picturesque coastal village. It was named La Cala de Millas in the southern Spanish province of Malaga, and had made fast friends following Amy's immigration from her native Ireland. Hanging out with Ashley and her little brother was something Amy took a huge amount of solace in, as it was so secret that she was unhappy with her family's recent move. Cala de Millas and its surrounding hamlets enjoy semi-tropical temperatures all year round, and its public services are some of the best in the country. Yet Amy felt as though she'd been uprooted just as she was about to blossom, separated from her high school friends and struggling to learn Spanish. She found herself socially isolated and exceptionally homesick. Amy had been told to return home by 10 p.m. that evening, so shortly before the turn of the hour, she said goodbye to Ashley and her little brother, then started the short walk back to her family home. Her route should have taken her no more than a few minutes, but Amy didn't make it home at all that night. Recognizing that something was wrong, her parents immediately contacted local law enforcement, but following a preliminary investigation, the Spanish police seemed incredulous. They'd heard stories of how unhappy Amy had been following her immigration, and treated her disappearance as that of a runaway, as opposed to an abduction or a kidnapping. The police learned that Amy had been due to make a return trip to Ireland on December 26th, but after learning that the trip had been postponed, she was practically inconsolable. She said she couldn't wait to get back to Ireland. She'd had enough of Spain, Ashley Rose later told the Irish Independent newspaper. She went to 2 different schools and got bullied at both. She hated Spain. All she wanted to do was go back to Ireland. She was hoping that maybe she could go back and live with some of her family there. When Amy's parents finally convinced the police that she was no runaway and that their daughter might be in grave danger, officers made a horrifying admission. They weren't willing to say exactly how many, but Mijas and its wider region was home to several convicted pedophiles, all of whom were due for questioning in relation to Amy's disappearance. Such news would terrify any set of parents, no matter how capable or independent their child might be. But law enforcement had already failed to act urgently, meaning, if Amy had indeed been abducted, there was a chance that she'd suffer a fate worse than death. As the months progressed, the investigation failed to gain any traction, and a complete dearth of evidence meant detectives were flummoxed. On one hand, there was nothing to suggest that Amy had been snatched by some predatory pedophile, but on the other, police were still no closer to tracking her down, and her fate remained a complete mystery. But then, in the late summer of 2008, a development caused many to question just how deep the mystery ran. One night, the home of prominent Spanish attorney was burgled in his hometown of Riviera del Sol. 32-year-old Juan Jose returned home to find his house almost completely ransacked, but after the place was cleaned and his belongings accounted for, the attorney discovered that only 2 things were missing: the cell phone and laptop he used in the course of his employment. The stolen documents included confidential police reports about Fitzpatrick's disappearance, Senor Tejido later said. It makes no sense that they took documents which financially are worthless and left behind all my expensive valuables like TVs, computers, and music equipment. I believe the burglary was related to Amy's disappearance. It was a chilling revelation. Amy hadn't simply run away. she hadn't returned to Ireland to reunite with her friends and relatives. Someone had taken her, and that someone was brazen enough to smash their way into a professional's home to deny the investigation of trove of valuable evidence. All hope of Amy's safe return seemed lost, but then in June of 2009, Amy's mother received a telephone call that set her heart racing. Audrey Fitzpatrick described a man as having a North African accent, and once he'd confirmed her identity, he claimed to know the location of her long-lost daughter. He went on to say that she was in Madrid, but the police were not to be involved. Audrey later told Euro Weekly News, "I agreed to cooperate. Then he'd said he'd ring me back with the name and address in 2 hours. After 5 hours of sitting with my phone in my hand and my heart in my mouth, I got a text which read, 'Pay us €500,000. We will send you all the information you need.' Attached to the message were the numbers of 2 prepaid cell phones. These numbers were subsequently investigated by the Spanish police, as well as private investigators hired by Amy's parents. But since they'd been swiftly deactivated and were paid for in cash, tracing them proved impossible. The sudden deactivation of both prepaid phones has led many to conclude that the ransom demand was a bogus one. Amy's story had been widely publicized by the summer of 2009, and bogus ransom claims can be depressingly common in such cases. On top of that, most kidnap cases see a ransom demand delivered or announced within 24 hours of the abduction, not 18 months later. With the Madrid kidnapping lead determined to be false, Audrey Fitzpatrick hired a firm of highly reputable private investigators who had previously worked on the search for Madeleine McCann. After almost 3 years of working on the case, the private investigators returned to Amy's parents with a shocking and horrifying conclusion. They explained in the most sensitive way possible that there was a high probability that their daughter had become involved in a serious organized crime and had paid for it with her life. After following up a lead involving a suspected sighting of Amy, investigators discovered that she'd been in the company of a rather shady character on the day that she disappeared. Several individuals reported that, while Amy was on her way to Ashley Rose's place, a man named Eric Wilson stopped her in the street. Wilson was traveling in a vehicle at the time, rolled down his window to exchange words with Amy. Witnesses failed to hear what was said, but reported that Amy appeared disturbed following the conversation's conclusion. Amy's parents had never heard the name Eric Wilson before, but now it's likely they'll ever forget it. Eric Lucky Wilson, originally from Ballyfermot, South Dublin, was one of the most violent criminal gunmen in all of Europe. He was living in Spain after fleeing several arrest warrants in his native Ireland, and had been previously linked to several criminal organizations, including the Irish Republican Army. Since Amy's disappearance, he had been the perpetrator of a horrific shooting that had originated over nothing but a drunken scuffle. In June of 2010, Wilson had been drinking in a place called the Lounge Bar when he groped a girl known as Georgia. Georgia then complained to a friend named Daniel Smith, who confronted Wilson and reportedly shoved him when he refused to apologize. Wilson drove away from the bar on his motorcycle, but not before assuring Smith that he'd return to sort him out. Around an hour went by, long enough for Georgia and Daniel to let their guard down. That's when Lucky Wilson struck. He shot Daniel a total of 11 times, drawing out his execution to make it as painful as possible. The first shots shredded the tissue and bone of the man's legs, immobilizing him for what came next. Wilson then made a spectacle of shooting off Daniel's genitals, then shot him twice in the jaw to obliterate the lower section of his face. Wilson finally executed Daniel with a single shot to the spine, and later appeared in court following his apprehension by the Spanish authorities. Although he was never convicted of it, Wilson was strongly suspected of being involved in the international drug smuggling trade, but a particular interest was the exact role he played in the organization. It's been said that Wilson was charged with finding potential drug mules, individuals willing to smuggle drugs into the UK and Ireland either on their person or inside their body cavities. This has led some to theorize that Amy had volunteered herself to be a drug mule on the condition that the smugglers arranged for her to fly home to her city of Dublin. If this was true, Amy would have been party to some very secretive information and could have possibly been handed a sizable amount of cocaine or heroin. And if maybe something had happened to the quantity of drugs, or if maybe Amy had had second thoughts after being privy to such sensitive information, it would stand to reason that some ruthless individuals would opt to eliminate her rather than risk their overall operation. The evidence gathered by the Fitzpatrick's private investigator was so compelling. Amy's parents now believe this to be the most credible of all the theories. Eric Wilson has denied all involvement in her disappearance. We should take his pleas of innocent with a pinch of salt. Since then, there have been no developments in search of young Amy, but perhaps another significant clue involves the murder of her brother, Dean Fitzpatrick. In 2013, a then 23-year-old Dean became involved in a violent confrontation with his stepfather, Dave Mahan. Whatever Dean had done or admitted to, Mahan saw fit to grab a kitchen knife before stabbing his stepson to death. The details of the killing remain unknown. Shockingly, on May 6th of 2016, Dave Mahan was found not guilty of the murder, but instead convicted of manslaughter, a crime which comes with a 7-year prison sentence in the Republic of Ireland. But the conviction also sent a clear message. Whatever Dean Fitzpatrick had done, or had admitted to doing, was so atrocious that a judge and jury saw it fit to mitigate his killer's punishment. Whether or not that thing pertained to his sister's fate, it's not for me to say. But the Irish Mirror claimed that the fatal argument started over a water bottle. Granted, many of brutal murders have stemmed from a petty disagreement. Given the Fitzpatrick's family history, it seems impossible not to wonder if Dean's murder is tied to the wider mystery of Amy's disappearance. Perhaps one day, the truth behind both the Fitzpatrick's family tragedies will come out, and years of heartbreak, horror, and mystery will finally make sense. Yet it's just as likely that Amy's disappearance, Dean's death, will remain perplexing enigmas until there's no longer anyone left to remember them.